Welcome. Today we're opening up the files on what is, without a doubt, one of the most sensational and legally significant American murder cases of the 20th century. We're talking about the brutal murder of Marilyn Reese Sheppard. And if you're looking for a thorough understanding of how intense media pressure can just shatter due process and how forensic science struggles to correct past wrongs, these sources are, well, they're truly compelling.
They really are. And this case, it's so much more than just a true crime story. It's a fundamental moment in American law. Our exploration today will really focus on three pillars. First, the fatal flaws in that initial investigation. Then, how the media coverage, which was completely unprecedented, essentially destroyed Dr. Sheppard's constitutional rights. I mean, this went all the way to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
And finally, the decades-long effort by his family to use DNA evidence to find some kind of definitive answer. It's a story just marked by profound tragedy from the very beginning to the very end.
So let's set the stage. The central figure here is Dr. Samuel Holmes Sheppard. Everyone knew him as Sam. He was an osteopath, a highly regarded neurosurgeon in Cleveland, Ohio, and he came from this prominent medical family. He was the youngest of three sons, and they all followed their father into the family practice.
He was successful, very well respected. He'd done his residency in neurosurgery out in Los Angeles before coming back home to Ohio to join the family hospital, Bayview Hospital. He married his high school sweetheart, Marilyn Reese, back in 1945. So by 1954, they were living what looked like the perfect life. They were in Bay Village, this beautiful, affluent community right on the shore of Lake Erie. They had a son, Sam Reese, who they called Chip, and Marilyn was pregnant with their second child.
And that idyllic scene just shatters on the night of Saturday, July 3rd, 1954. The night itself began, normally enough. The Sheppards had a couple of neighbors over. They were just relaxing, watching a movie called Strange Holiday. And the sources confirm that after the neighbors left, this was around midnight, Marilyn walked them out. Sam, he said he fell asleep on the daybed downstairs in the living room.
Right. And what happened next took place in the very, very early hours of July 4th. Sometime between 3:00 and 4 a.m., Marilyn Reese Sheppard was. She was violently bludgeoned to death in her own bed. The weapon was never found. The severity of the attack was just immediately clear to anyone who saw the room. It was described as horrific. The bedroom was covered in blood spatter, just evidence of extreme focused violence. And there were drops of blood found on the floors throughout the house.
And we really have to understand Dr. Sheppard's immediate account of what happened, because that story became the absolute cornerstone of his defense for the next 12 years. And it was also the immediate point of contention for the prosecution.
His story was remarkably detailed, and he kept it consistent through all the trials, all the interrogations. He testified he was sleeping on that daybed when he was woken up by his wife's cries. He initially described them as agonized screams. He said he ran upstairs thinking maybe she was having convulsions, which he claimed were similar to some reactions she'd had early in the pregnancy.
Okay, so he runs upstairs. What did he claim he saw when he got into the bedroom?
He said as he entered the room, he saw a white biped form. That's how he put it. He thought it was grappling with something or someone over Marilyn's side of the bed. But before he could really process it or do anything, he testified he was struck from behind and knocked unconscious immediately. And that's the first blackout in his story.
That is the critical moment. He says he was attacked by an intruder. So what happened when he woke up? What was his state then?
He said he came to maybe minutes later and found himself in a sitting position next to the bed. He looked at Marilyn, he checked her pulse, and he determined that she was, in his words, gone. Then, crucially, he ran across the hall to his 7-year-old son's room, Chip's room. And Chip was asleep, apparently undisturbed through all of this. Sheppard said he checked on him, saw he was all right, and then went back to the master bedroom.
But according to him, the ordeal wasn't over. He thought the intruder was still there.
That's right. He said he heard a noise downstairs, somewhere in the front of the house, so he ran back down, thinking the person was still on the premises, and he chased what he described as a bushy-haired intruder. The chase went out of the house, down a set of stairs to the Lake Erie beach right below their home. And there, he said he tackled the intruder, they struggled, and he was knocked unconscious a second time, a blow to the back of the neck. He claimed when he woke up that second time, he was soaking wet, just lying in the sand.
It's an incredibly dramatic story. And the scene when the neighbors got there, Sheppard had called them around 5:40 a.m. It was just chaotic. He was shirtless, he seemed disoriented, in shock, his pants were wet, and there was a noticeable blood stain on one knee.
It was those first impressions and the very specific, sometimes contradictory details that immediately steered investigators down one path, and that path led directly to Dr. Sheppard. The authorities just felt his story didn't fit the forensic reality of the scene.
So what were the key pieces of physical evidence that seemed to contradict his narrative? This story of a violent, messy intruder from outside.
There were several things the authorities really seized on. First, the lack of noise, specifically the family dog. The Sheppards had a little terrier. It was known to bark at strangers, but the dog wasn't heard barking by anyone, not the neighbors, not Sam Sheppard himself. And that suggested, a lack of alarm right when two supposedly violent struggles were taking place.
The dog's silence implies the attacker was known to the dog, or...
Or that there was no attacker. Exactly. Second, the blood evidence was a huge problem for Sam's story. As we said, the bedroom was a scene of just extreme violence, high-velocity blood spatter everywhere. Yet the only blood found on Sam Sheppard was that one stain on his trousers, and some minor smearing. The prosecution immediately argued this was just totally inconsistent. If he'd grappled with a bloody assailant, not once but twice, he should have been covered in blood.
Right.
Especially in the bedroom.
And the missing items. That added another layer of suspicion,
Yeah.
right? It suggests that the scene had been staged.
Absolutely. Several of Sam Sheppard's personal things were missing. His wristwatch, his keychain and key, his fraternity ring. At first, it looked like a theft, a break-in. However, these items were later found in a canvas bag, hidden in some bushes behind the house. It was far from the beach where the supposed final struggle happened, so this suggested the theft wasn't the real motive. It looked more like a clumsy attempt to stage a break-in after the murder had already occurred.
So from the very beginning, you have this successful surgeon with this dramatic story, but it's immediately undercut by, by the silent dog. The weird placement of the stolen items and the almost total lack of blood on him. It sounds like investigators felt they were handed an alibi that was just full of holes. How did the legal process start from there?
Well, the public environment was just growing toxic very quickly. The coroner, Samuel Gerber, he was notoriously aggressive, and he publicly focused on Sam almost immediately. The key legal step, or really misstep, was the public inquest he held. Now, inquests are supposed to just determine the cause of death, but this one devolved into a public spectacle. Sheppard was questioned for hours without a lawyer present. It was basically a preliminary trial held for the media. And the papers just ran wild with all the sensational details, framing Sheppard as the obvious suspect from day one.
That inherent contradiction in the evidence and the prominence of the family, it just created this explosive atmosphere around the first trial. The pressure moved from investigation to persecution very fast.
And that's where the failure of the justice system really begins.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The trial starts on October 18th, 1954. It lasts for 9 grueling weeks. But the actual legal proceedings were immediately and completely overshadowed by what legal scholars now call extreme, pervasive, and highly biased publicity.
The media didn't just report on the case. They were essentially trying the case in the newspapers before the jury even heard the opening arguments.
Unprecedented doesn't even begin to cover it. The U.S. Supreme Court, when they look back at this, they issued this scathing condemnation of the media, especially the Cleveland press. They said the paper took the role of accuser, judge, and jury. The media was actively driving the investigation. They were demanding the arrest. You can see it in the timeline, a direct cause and effect.
Tell us about that timeline, because the sources show the press was literally dictating the pace of the police work. Precisely. On July 21st, 1954, the Cleveland Press runs this screaming front-page editorial. It's in all caps. It says, "Do it now, Dr. Gerber." They were demanding the coroner hold a public hearing. And just hours later, Dr. Gerber announced he would hold an immediate public inquest the very next day, just as the paper commanded.
Wow. And the pressure just kept mounting, leading directly to the arrest.
Yes. On July 30th, the Cleveland Press runs another, even more aggressive front-page editorial. The headline was, "Why isn't Sam Sheppard in jail?" In later editions that day, they changed it to, "Quit stalling and bring him in." That same night, Sheppard was arrested. The official actions were only taken after being publicly demanded by the city's biggest newspaper. It was a total capitulation of the justice system.
And the contamination of the jury because of all this publicity, that's the central point of the Supreme Court's later intervention. It made the whole trial just fundamentally unfair.
It's a tragic example of the failure of the presiding judge, Edward Blythen. The jury was never sequestered. They went home every night. They were exposed to this constant, uncontrolled flow of inflammatory, often salacious front-page stories. The sources detail reports that had no supporting facts or were later proven false. But these rumors became fact in the court of public opinion. For instance, during the trial, a popular local radio show broadcast this report claiming Sheppard had a mistress in New York City who was the mother of his illegitimate child. It was completely unsubstantiated, but so damaging.
And what was the judge's response to that specific, incredibly inflammatory broadcast?
Two jurors actually admitted to Judge Blythen that they'd heard it, and unbelievably, he refused to dismiss them. He didn't even poll the rest of the jury to see how widespread the damage was. The consensus from later legal review, including the Supreme Court, was that the trial was conducted in a carnival atmosphere. It made it impossible for the jury to remain impartial.
So despite this incredibly hostile environment, the defense attorney, William Corrigan, still had to present a case. What were the core arguments he relied on?
Corrigan's strategy really focused on two major points: proving Sheppard's own injuries were real and arguing the blood evidence just didn't point to his guilt. For the injuries, the defense brought in a noted neurosurgeon, a Dr. Charles Elkins, who had examined Sheppard. Dr. Elkins reported that Sheppard had suffered serious trauma, a cervical concussion, definite nerve injury, and absent or weak reflexes, especially on his left side. Elkins testified that these reflex responses were impossible to fake, so they must have been inflicted by the intruder.
So the defense was trying to prove that Sam was a victim of an assault himself, not the perpetrator.
Precisely. And the second major argument was about the blood. Corrigan argued forcefully that the sheer volume of blood at the scene, he said it was splattered across the walls, meant that whoever did the beating should have been soaked in it. And since Sheppard only had that one single bloodstain on his pants, Corrigan argued he couldn't have been the killer.
The defense also pointed to Marilyn's physical state, her mouth, specifically, as evidence of an intruder.
Yes, that was a key detail. The defense highlighted that two of Marilyn's teeth had been broken, and the pieces seemed to have been pulled from her mouth. Corrigan argued this strongly suggested she had bitten her assailant during the struggle.
But was that definitive? I mean, it sounds like that could have just been caused by the beating itself.
It was contested at the time, yes. But the renowned criminologist, Paul Kirk, he later provided an affidavit confirming the importance of this. Kirk stated that if the beating had broken the teeth, the pieces would have been found inside her mouth or nearby. That wasn't the case. The fact that the pieces were missing gave real credibility to the theory she'd bitten the attacker, and this piece of forensic logic became extremely important years later.
And Sheppard did take the stand in his own defense in 1954. Right, he told that whole dramatic story again.
He did. He reiterated the entire narrative, waking up to screams, the form in the dark, the first blackout, the chase, the second blackout on the beach. He endured a brutal cross-examination. The defense also called 18 character witnesses and two people who testified they had seen a bushy-haired man near the Sheppard home that morning. But in the end, the overwhelming tide of media-fueled public opinion was just too strong.
On December 21st, 1954, after 4 long days of deliberation, the jury found Sam Sheppard guilty of second-degree murder. He was given a life sentence.
And the verdict sealed his fate, but the tragedy for the immediate family was just beginning. It became this immediate, compounding catastrophe. Just weeks after the conviction, in January of 1955, Sheppard was in prison when he was told his mother, Ethel Sheppard, had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound.
That is just heartbreaking.
It is. The stress, the notoriety, it was just too much for the family. And then just 11 days after his mother's death, his father, Dr. Richard Sheppard, died of a bleeding gastric ulcer and stomach cancer. Sam Sheppard was allowed to attend both funerals, but in this horrific, very public display, he had to wear handcuffs the entire time. The sources just paint a picture of a family completely destroyed.
And the emotional devastation just kept rippling outward. Years later, in 1963, while the appeal process was still going on, Marilyn's own father, Thomas Reese, also died by suicide.
The pressure and the heartbreak of this whole affair it consumed 3 more people in the wake of the murder and conviction.
The initial appeals were handled by Sheppard's first lawyer, William Corrigan, but they were all rejected. After Corrigan died in 1961, the legal fight got new life and a new, electrifying strategic direction when a very ambitious F. Lee Bailey took over.
Bailey's arrival was really the beginning of the end for that flawed verdict. He was relentless. He argued that the media bias had fundamentally denied Sheppard a fair trial, which is a constitutional right. He took the case all the way up the judicial ladder. And in 1964, a U.S. District Court judge finally granted a writ of habeas corpus. Now, for listeners who aren't familiar, that's basically a legal tool to determine if a person's imprisonment is even lawful. The judge didn't rule on guilt or innocence, but he called the 1954 trial a mockery of justice that had just shredded Sheppard's 14th Amendment rights.
So the argument wasn't that he was innocent, but that the process itself was corrupt.
Exactly. The process was judged to be corrupt. The state of Ohio was ordered to either re-indict him or dismiss the case for good. Based on that ruling, Sheppard was released on bond after serving 10 years in prison. Ohio immediately appealed, of course, so the final decision rested with the Supreme Court.
And Bailey prevailed at highest level. This resulted in one of the most significant Supreme Court rulings ever regarding the media and the courts.
In 1966, the Supreme Court struck down the conviction in Sheppard v. Maxwell. It was a definitive 8-1 vote. And this decision is a landmark in media law. Its implications are still felt today. The Supreme Court confirmed that a carnival atmosphere had permeated the 1954 trial. That phrase became legendary in legal circles.
What specifically was the court's reasoning for overturning it?
Well, they cited the abject failure of the trial judge, Edward Blythen, who had died by then. Judge Blythen had failed to control the courtroom, he'd failed to sequester the jury, and he failed to instruct them to disregard the media reports. And perhaps most damningly, the Supreme Court noted that Judge Blythen had been quoted saying to a newspaper columnist right before the trial began, well, he's guilty as hell, there's no question about it.
That is an astonishing breach of impartiality from a judge. I mean, how could any defense attorney possibly fight that level of prejudgment from the bench?
They couldn't. The Supreme Court's ruling validated Bailey's whole argument. Sheppard never had a chance at a fair trial. And beyond just Sheppard's case, the Sheppard v. Maxwell decision set a major precedent. It outlined tools that trial judges must use to protect a defendant's rights from excessive publicity. Things like gag orders, strict jury sequestration, controlling press access, and granting changes of venue. It permanently changed the relationship between the press and the courts.
So while this legal battle was escalating, Dr. Sheppard had served 10 years. His personal life also took a dramatic turn as soon as he was released.
It did. After his release in 1964, just 3 days later, he married a German divorcee, Ariane Tebben-Johans. He had corresponded with her while he was in prison, and this marriage was immediately steeped in controversy because Tebben-Johans had a direct family connection to a truly reviled figure from World War II.
She had to address media scrutiny over her family, correct?
Yes. Her half-sister was Magd Rischel, the wife of the Nazi propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels. Tebben-Johans had to publicly state that she herself held no Nazi views. Their marriage was brief, though. They divorced in 1969.
So now we come to the 1966 retrial. With the Supreme Court having chastised Ohio, the atmosphere had to be completely different.
It was night and day, because the judge was forced to follow the new rules set by the Supreme Court. The biggest difference was that the jury was finally and very strictly sequestered. The prosecution, now facing F. Lee Bailey, essentially presented the same case as 12 years before. They focused on motive and circumstantial evidence.
How did Bailey change his strategy for the retrial?
His strategy was streamlined, much more focused on just destroying the prosecution's theory. Crucially, neither Sam Sheppard nor Susan Hayes, the lab technician he'd had an affair with, took the stand this time. Bailey wanted the jury focused purely on the evidence and the lack of a plausible murder weapon.
Bailey's cross-examination, as the sources suggest, was the absolute cornerstone of the defense.
It was devastating for the prosecution. Bailey just aggressively discredited every one of their witnesses by highlighting the shoddy original investigation. When Coroner Gerber testified about a hypothetical, unidentified surgical weapon, Bailey forced him to admit under oath that they never found a murder weapon. They had nothing tangible to tie Sheppard to the murder. Bailey was brilliant. In his closing argument, he dismissed the entire prosecution case with the famous line, 10 pounds of hogwash in a 5-pound bag.
But beyond just dismantling the prosecution's theories, the defense also brought in a crucial, highly technical piece of forensic evidence that wasn't properly used in the first trial.
This is where the work of criminologist Paul Kirk became pivotal. Kirk had analyzed the crime scene back in 1955, and he presented his detailed blood spatter analysis. His method was based on carefully mapping the origin and velocity of the blood spatter, and he concluded, based on the specific angles, that the murderer was likely left-handed.
And Sam Sheppard was definitively right-handed. That's tangible evidence pointing to an intruder.
It provided real scientific support for the intruder theory, something the 1954 jury was denied. The combination of Kirk's science, the lack of a murder weapon, and Bailey's blistering defense. It was enough. After just 12 hours of deliberation, the sequestered jury came back with a not guilty verdict on November 16, 1966.
The acquittal was a monumental victory for Sam Sheppard, and it cemented F. Lee Bailey's rise to prominence as a legendary defense lawyer. But the story, as we now know, was far from over.
The acquittal should have been a moment of total rehabilitation, but what followed was a period of rapid and, frankly, profoundly tragic decline for Dr. Sheppard. His life had been entirely defined by the murder, the conviction, the fight for freedom. It was impossible for him to return to any kind of normalcy.
He leaned into the fame and notoriety, though, didn't he?
He did. He worked with a ghostwriter to produce the book Endure and Conquer, detailing his side of the story. What's fascinating is that the ghostwriter, Bill Levy, later admitted he felt deeply conflicted because he privately believed Sheppard was guilty even after the acquittal. Sheppard also went on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson soon after. He was maximizing his celebrity.
And here's where it gets really interesting and deeply unexpected. His brief, shocking pivot into professional wrestling.
It's a true anomaly, and it perhaps speaks to his search for a new identity or maybe just a distraction. He was introduced to wrestling by his friend, a pro wrestler named George Strickland, who later became his father-in-law. Strickland trained him, and he debuted in August 1969 at age 45 as a heel, a villain under the sensational name Killer Sam Sheppard.
Killer Sam Sheppard. That name alone must have been a media circus, just capitalizing on the public's memory of the case.
It was a huge draw. He was notorious. He sold tickets. He wrestled over 40 matches before he died. But it wasn't just a stunt. He actually contributed something to the sport, blending his medical knowledge with performance. Dr. Sheppard developed a new submission hold he called the mandibular nerve pinch, applying pressure to a nerve cluster in the jaw. That move was later popularized as the mandible claw by the wrestler Mankind in the 90s.
While his wrestling career was this bizarre spectacle, his attempt to reestablish his medical career and his personal life were just spiraling downwards.
The final years were marked by a severe deterioration due to advanced alcoholism. He tried to resume his medical practice in a Columbus suburb, but tragically our sources indicate that his skills as a once gifted surgeon had deteriorated. He was frequently impaired by alcohol, which is just unforgivable in an operating room.
And this impairment led to catastrophic, tragic results.
Horrific results. It really underscores the total destruction of his professional standing. Shortly after getting surgical privileges again, he performed a discectomy, a spine procedure. During it, he accidentally cut a major artery. The patient died the next day. A few months later, in another surgery, he nicked an artery on another patient, a 29-year-old, who bled to death internally.
2 patient deaths directly linked to surgical errors.
Yes, and these led to 2 wrongful death suits. Sheppard resigned from the hospital staff just a few months later. It was the end of his medical career for good. It just speaks to the immense pressures, the trauma of prison, the notoriety. It completely destroyed his ability to cope.
It sounds like a man completely consumed by trauma and notoriety, using alcohol to escape.
His self-destruction was rapid. 6 months before his death, he married Colleen Strickland, his wrestling friend's daughter. But by the end, he was drinking. Well, he was reportedly consuming as much as 2/5 of liquor a day. That's about 1.5 liters of hard alcohol daily.
Dr. Sam Sheppard died suddenly on April 6, 1970, at age 46.
The official cause of death was determined to be Wernicke encephalopathy. For those unfamiliar with the term, it's a severe neurological disorder caused by advanced thiamine deficiency, which is very common in chronic, advanced alcoholism. It results in brain damage. It was a tragic, swift end for a man whose life was destroyed by a crime he was acquitted of.
The acquittal in 1966 established that the conviction was illegal, but it didn't establish his innocence. And Sam Rees Chip Sheppard, the son who slept through the murder, devoted his entire adult life to achieving total, final exoneration for his father. This mission culminated in a highly publicized 1999 civil trial for wrongful imprisonment against the state of Ohio.
The son's efforts meant that modern forensic science DNA testing was finally brought to bear on this 1954 crime. In 1997, Sam Sheppard's body was exhumed for DNA testing. The lawyer for the Sheppard estate later stated that the testing absolved Sheppard because it confirmed there was blood at the scene belonging to a third person, neither Sam nor Marilyn. This definitively supported the intruder theory. After the testing, Sam's ashes were finally interred with Marilyn's remains.
And Marilyn's body was also exhumed, correct? What did that reveal after so many years?
Yes, in 1999, one of the goals was paternity testing on the fetus. That was ultimately inconclusive because of tissue degradation. But the exhumation revealed an astonishing hidden fact, something that had never been disclosed in either trial.
What was that?
The exhumation showed that the fetus had been previously autopsied. The Sheppard family's attorney argued forcefully that this undisclosed autopsy. It raised serious questions about the original investigation. The possibility of evidence concealment by the coroner's office back in '54, it spoke volumes about the original bias.
The DNA evidence, confirming a third person, shifted the focus entirely. The civil suit then concentrated on the alternative suspect who had been lurking in the background for years, Richard Eberling.
Richard Eberlin was the primary focus of the civil suit, yes. He was the occasional handyman and window washer at the Sheppard home. He knew the layout, he had access, and sources suggest he found Marilyn attractive.
And what initially linked him to the crime, years later?
Well, in 1959, detectives questioned Eberling about local burglaries. He confessed, and critically, he was found to have 2 of Marilyn Sheppard's rings. He claimed he'd stolen them in 1958, 4 years after the murder, from a box at Sam's brother's house. And in later questioning, Eberling also admitted his blood was at the crime scene. But he had an innocent explanation. He said he'd cut his finger washing windows there before the murder.
So he admits his blood was there but offers an explanation. How did investigators deal with that?
His story was immediately complicated by conflicting polygraph results. The first examiner said he showed no deception, but other experts, years later, found the results inconclusive or even deceptive, and this led to a famous declaration. F. Lee Bailey himself testified in the 2000 civil trial that he deeply regretted rejecting Eberling as a suspect back in 1966, based solely on that original polygraph.
So let's talk about the modern DNA evidence during that civil trial. Even with a third person confirmed, why couldn't they definitively tie the crime to Eberling?
This really comes down to the complex interplay between old and new science and specific legal standards. The DNA did confirm blood from a third person, excluding Sam and Marilyn, but tying it conclusively to Eberling was, well, it was legally inconclusive. One plaintiff DNA expert stated he was 90% confident that one of the blood spots belonged to Richard Eberling.
Why wasn't 90% confidence enough to be presented as definitive?
In the year 2000, forensic standards were highly scrutinized. A 90% confidence level, it points strongly in a direction, but it wasn't admissible to definitively link him to the crime. And furthermore, the defense counter-argued using the older blood typing from the 50s. A key blood spot on a closet door had been identified back then as type O. Richard Eberling's blood type was type A. So, that contradiction meant the DNA evidence, while powerful in excluding Sam Sheppard, wasn't legally conclusive enough to prove wrongful imprisonment by naming Eberling as the murderer.
But despite that, Eberling's own background provides a chilling, highly suspicious context for why he was so strongly pursued.
He had a pattern of association with violence against elderly women. He was eventually convicted for the 1984 murder of Ethel Mae Durkin, a wealthy, elderly widow. Her death was first ruled accidental, but her body was later exhumed, and injuries were found that were inconsistent with a fall. Eberling had been her guardian and was found to have mishandled her estate.
And the sources note that Durkin's own sisters also died under very suspicious circumstances.
Indeed, it's a highly disturbing pattern. Both of Durkin's sisters died while Eberling was active in their lives. One was savagely beaten and strangled. The other died from a fall that broke all 4 of her limbs. Eberling died in prison in 1998, serving a life sentence for the Durkin murder. He took any absolute confirmation about the Sheppard case with him.
And during the civil trial, there was testimony claiming Eberling confessed, but that was disputed, right?
Yes. 2 witnesses came forward claiming he had confessed to them. But the defense in the civil trial called the credibility and motives of both witnesses into question. So the ultimate evidence remained contested. It just shows how difficult it is to find the truth decades after a corrupted initial investigation.
The civil trial for wrongful imprisonment lasted 12 weeks. It had 76 witnesses. And the plaintiff, Sam Reese Sheppard, only needed to prove his father was wrongfully imprisoned by a preponderance of the evidence, a lower standard than criminal court.
That's a critical distinction. It means the jury only needed to believe it was more likely than not that Sam Sheppard was wrongfully imprisoned. Yet, even with that lower standard and the compelling DNA evidence, the jury didn't spend long deliberating.
How long did they deliberate?
Just 3 hours. On April 12, 2000, they returned a unanimous verdict. They stated that Samuel Reese Sheppard had failed to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that his father had been wrongfully imprisoned. The civil exoneration attempt had failed.
And even after that verdict, the legal complexity continued, denying any final clarity.
It did. In 2002, an appeals court invalidated the whole claim on technical grounds. They said the statute of limitations had expired and that a claim for wrongful imprisonment ends with the person's death. So in the end, while Sheppard was acquitted of murder in 1966, he was never officially declared wrongfully imprisoned by the state.
The Sam Sheppard case spanning over 50 years of legal battles, remains highly visible in our cultural memory, not just as a murder case, but as a profound study in media excess.
Absolutely. The legacy is enormous. The case records, over 60 boxes, are now digitized at Cleveland State University for anyone to study. It directly inspired the 1970 film The Lawyer and other works.
And for many, it remains the ultimate example of the wrongfully accused doctor. It's often cited as the inspiration for the TV series and film The Fugitive.
And while that cultural connection is undeniable, it is important to note the creators of The Fugitive always adamantly denied any direct creative connection to the Sheppard case. But the cultural shadow cast by his plight certainly fueled that narrative.
So what does this all mean for us, looking at the entire arc of this story? From the brutal crime against Marilyn Reese Sheppard to the media frenzy to the acquittal and the failed civil suit.
If we try to connect this to the bigger picture, the 1966 acquittal was a procedural victory. It corrected a profound error in due process caused by the media, and that decision fundamentally protected the rights of future defendants. However, the civil trial, the DNA, the focus on Richard Eberling, they all show that the identity of Marilyn Reese Sheppard's murderer remains officially undetermined and complexly layered. Justice achieved a procedural win, but the factual truth was never definitively established in a court of law.
It's a devastating reminder that a deeply flawed initial investigation, corrupted by external bias, can permanently obscure the truth.
And this raises an important question for us to consider, especially today, with evolving forensics and constant information overload. What constitutes a definitive truth when the initial investigation was so deeply flawed? The person who bludgeoned Marilyn Reese Sheppard to death has never been conclusively identified, and the true cost of that failure was the destruction of Sam Sheppard's life and career, culminating in his premature, tragic death.
A truly compelling and tragic legacy that continues to resonate today.
Indeed.
Thank you for joining us for this analysis of the sources surrounding the Sam Sheppard murder case.
We hope the details and context provided a clearer view of this pivotal, complex, and tragic moment in legal history.
Thanks for listening.